go take a biplane ride?
We're passing on our love of the sky and flying. Really, that's what we're doing.
My name is Dennis Wortman. I live on Hines Point here in Vineyard Haven. I will be 73 years old in this coming April. That would be in the year 2011. My first flight was in 1954. I would have been 16 years old. And I was coming back to the Vineyard from New Bedford. Flew over on a DC-3 Northeast Airlines. Nervous, was a young kid, never been up in the air. But I thought, this is pretty cool. And, you know, what was it, a 10, 15-minute flight. And I thought that was pretty nice. And then I actually went on to visit a friend in Nantucket. So I landed here and we went on to Nantucket. And that was it for aviation. I hadn't flown again for several years. Then when I went off to college, my first year I was at the University of Miami in Florida. And I'd been thinking about flying lessons, you know, that it might be a fun thing to do. Stuart Bangs, who I had worked for in Bangs Market and here in Vineyard Haven, had been a pilot back in the 40s, and he had told me stories which sort of turned me on to aviation. So anyway, one day when I'm at school, a friend of mine down there said, "You want to take a flying lesson?" I said, "Sure." So he and I went out to Tamiami Airport. This is the old Tamiami Airport. And we each took a half-hour lesson in a Piper Tri-Pacer. Oh man, that was it. I thought, this is really pretty cool. And this would have been January of 1958. As a matter of fact, that day is, I looked at my logbook. It's 2 days from today. My first lesson. Well, I couldn't wait for the next day to come because I wanted to get back to the airport and take an hour lesson. My friend, he never went back to the airport. That half hour was his. I went back either the day after or 2 days and started taking lessons. It was really great. The lessons back then were at a place called Liberty Aviation at Tamiami Airport. It was $10 an hour dual, 7 solo. My instructor was a fellow named Sig Kugler. Very, very nice fellow. And the lessons were in an Aranca Champ, known as an Aranca 7AC, which is 2 seats, fore and aft tandem seating. The student would sit in the front seat, the instructor in the back seat. 65 horsepower Continental engine. No electricity in the plane. When you started it, you know, the old story, the guys out front, contact and pull the propeller, you know, and then it would cough and spit and start to life, and 65 roaring horsepower, you know, and you'd taxi out. And this is a tailwheel plane. So the first thing is you learn to taxi it. Went out, Sid took off and we flew up, and he showed me how, and it's flew with a stick. And straight and level, and then a few climbs and glides and making some turns. And I couldn't wait to get back the next day. And the next day I'd saved up a few bucks. And then, I guess it was about 7 or 8 hours into instruction. My folks had actually come down to Florida to visit. And I asked my dad if he would give me $100, which of course $100 back then was a lot more than it was now. And also to sign off that I could solo, because I was underage. I was only 19 years old, and very nicely he said, yeah, he would do that. So anyway, I think I had about 9 hours, and Sid and I had been flying for about 20 minutes, takeoff and landing, staying in the pattern. And we got to the end of runway where we'd take off, and Sid said, seems like there's something wrong with the right brake here. He says, I'm going to get out of the plane and check it. Well, he got out of the plane, and he just looked at me and he just smiled. He says, now you go out there and you do it. He says, I want you to take off and go around the pattern 3 times. Do 3 takeoffs, 3 landings, and I'm going to stand right here and watch you. And of course, I was just beaming from ear to ear, but also a little nervous this first flight. I felt pretty confident, and I thought if he thought I could do it, that would be fine too. So I remember taking off, and I kept looking around in the back seat just to make sure I was still alone. It was sort of a mind-boggling experience. But I came back in, landed, bounced it a little bit, but not bad, and then touch and go, and added the power and went back around and did it 3 times. Then stopped and picked Sid up. He got back in the plane, and we taxied in and had a little ceremony. And that was sort of a big day. You've soloed, you think, oh man, you're a hot ticket now. Well, soloing really is just the beginning. You really don't know a lot about flying. So from there, we progressed to doing more air maneuvers, then getting into cross country. And these planes, this little 7AC, had no radio. I mean, it was all looking at roads, looking for lakes and crossing over those, looking for railroad tracks, dead reckoning navigation. But it was fun. And I remember we flew from Miami all the way up to Fort Lauderdale. It's not that far. And Fort Lauderdale had a tower. We didn't have a radio. So he showed me how you enter the pattern, you waggle your wings, and you look at the tower, and you look for the green light. They're going to shoot a green light at you to give you the landing. Or shoot the red light if you can't come in now. So it was all by lights. That just doesn't happen in these days. So anyway, I did a few cross countries, and then to get your license, you need to do a 100-mile cross country. So I did it up to, where was it? It was about 100 miles north of Miami. I forget the exact town. And that was no problem. Then we wanted to do a longer cross country. So there were 3 other students and myself, and we each took a plane, a Ronca Champ. And we flew out of Tamiami. We landed down at this beautiful little grass strip called Ocean Reef, which was just about 25 miles south of Miami. Landed there first, took off. Now, we all were flying in formation. Now, this was fun. We were all playing follow the leader. And we flew down, and as we got down a little over the Keys, we decided we were going to fly low. So back then you could get away with a lot. Things were a lot more relaxed. So we dropped down to 50 feet, and we flew over the beaches, and there's that long, I believe it's a 7-mile bridge from one of the Keys to the other, and we went right down next to the bridge, following each other. And the Ronca cruised at 80 miles an hour. Well, some of the cars were actually passing us. And we went down. It was fun. And then we landed at Marathon, which has about an 8,000-foot runway, refueled down there, and went on down to Key West, just following the beaches all the way. Landed at Key West, got a bite to eat, got back in the plane, did the same thing coming back, and it was great sport. It was so nice to be able to do that, and I feel so fortunate that I learned to fly back in 1958, because there were things you could do then which you absolutely cannot do today. There are so many restricted areas today. There are so many rules and regulations. And with all the security threats that are going on, if you were to do what we used to do, my Lord, you'd have an F-16 on your wing with some guy in there pointing, "Get down and follow me." But I made 2 of those trips from Miami down to Key West and back, and it was just so beautiful to be able to do that. So on May 20th of 1958, I was signed off, and I took my check ride to get my private license. That was a exciting time, and it went very well. Came down, and the fellow hopped out of the plane, and he signed my ticket. And my college roommate was Peter Betancourt from Edgartown, and he was waiting. And as soon as that ink was on the ticket, Peter and I got in the plane, and we took off and went flying for an hour out over Biscayne Bay, and just having a good time. And I showed him what maneuvers I had done, the different types of stalls, and turns about a point, and 720s. And I guess it must have affected him, because a number of years later he got his private license too. But that was a lot of good sport. Then it was time a few weeks after that to come back to the Vineyard, and I came back, and of course wanted to do some flying, and I was thinking, knew Carolyn Cullen over at Oak Bluffs Airport, trade winds. So as soon as I got back, I went over and saw her, and she checked me out in her J3 Cub, which in many ways is similar to the Aranca Champ, except there the pilot sits in the back seat and your passenger sits in the front seat. The reason for that is when you solo a J3 Cub, when you go by yourself, you have to sit in the back seat for weight and balance. You've got to balance it. Now, if you were taking a passenger, of course you could fly it from the front seat, because you'd have the 2 people in. But I always put my passengers in the front seat. They got a better view. And back then, here again, like I said, had a good time. Used to fly around the Vineyard, fly up around, drop down below the Gayhead Cliffs, come down across the South Shore, seeing all the bathing beauties up there swimming down the beaches. I had friends that lived in Squibnocket. I'd fly over their house. Sometimes you'd throttle that engine back, and it was so quiet, and I'd yell out the window, and they could hear me. And sometimes I was a little low, and I could hear them back, too. But that was great sport. And I took a lot of friends flying who had never been up in an airplane before. And I've got all their names in my logbook of when I took them. And then I was working in Bangs Market again that summer, and I'd have a 2-hour lunch. So I'd call a friend up, or have a friend meet me. We'd go over to go over to Oak Bluffs, get Carolyn's Cub, fly over to Nantucket, have lunch at the airport, fly back, and then I'd be back at work at 2 o'clock. It was just a fun thing to do on a nice day. Why not go up? Here again, it was costing solo, it was $7 an hour. Of course, it sounds real cheap, but back in those days, you only earned about $1 an hour. Oh, and by the way, when I was getting my license down in Florida, I ended up working at the airport too as a line boy, starting airplanes, parking airplanes, to pay for my flying lessons. And I got paid $1 an hour. The only discount I got is they still paid me when I went flying. So I'd be paying $7, but I'd get paid $1 for that hour that I was up too. Oh, and then at the end of the day, another fella and I, we would put the airplanes away, And sometimes if there was like a little shower that was coming through the area, not a heavy thunder shower, but a little rain squall, we'd take the planes up actually and we'd fly through them to wash them. It was good sport. So, you know, that was my early flying experiences. Nomans Land was restricted. That had a restricted area around it because the Navy still used it back then for bombing and strafing. And it was funny, one day I can remember in the J3 Cub coming around the Gay Head Cliffs and then coming down low over the beach, and I saw 4 A4s coming down the beach the other way. They'd been over at Nomans. And now they're coming at me, and I'm coming at them. So I dropped down very low. I probably dropped down to 10 or 15 feet over the water. I just wanted to get as low as I could. And they went over the top of me. And I didn't want to get in any wake turbulence or you know, any kind of turbulence from them. So I remember turning it very slowly out and getting out from underneath it before climbing back up again. But that was sort of fun. The grass strips on the island. First of all, well, there were 2. There was Trade Winds in Oak Bluffs and the Katama Air Park in Edgartown. And I did a lot of flying out of Oak Bluffs, flying Carolyn's J3. There'd be a number of airplanes. She also had a super cruiser. I never flew that. But I'm trying to think back. It was a busy little place. She was giving lessons. People went there for instruction. And on weekends, number of planes would come in. And back then, some of the fish spotters kept their planes in there. Katama was always busy. They had a place where you could, people could fly in and then go park and then walk across and go to the beach, which they still have. But today, really, Oak Bluffs, Trade Winds is a dog park, which is sort of sad. I mean, it's nice that dogs have a place to go, but the aviation in Katama is very little right now. I guess a few planes can still have permission to fly in and out of there, but it's seldom that I've seen a plane in there in the last 10 years. Of course, Katama still continues to be a busy little airport. They've got the 2 biplanes. They give the rides, and you can take lessons out there, and you can go up in a sailplane. Because I really didn't hang out at Katama. And then I would sometimes go over, if I'd pick a friend up or something, I might go over to the Martha's Vineyard Airport and go in there. There was no control tower back then. Because here again, the J3 Cub had no radio. You just flew, you entered the pattern on the downwind, you made the base, you turned final, and you landed. You kept your eyes open. I think, in the early days, of course, Northeast was still flying in there. They were getting rid of the DC-3s. They were getting Convairs. And what was it? Executive Airlines came in after that, and they were flying Twin Otters. Northeast also, then they got the Yellowbird. They were flying 727s in there. There was no military activity when I was flying in and out of there, but there was a fella who had a P-51 and a T-28. Now, a T-28 is a Navy trainer, and beautiful airplane. And he had 2 of those, which he would have there in the summer. His name slips me right now. I know he was CEO of a large electronics, I think CEO of Electronics Corporation of America, which was in Cambridge. I mean, most of my flying back then in that Cub was very, very localized to right here. It wasn't until later when I started flying, out of Marlborough Airport, when number of years later, I was living in Sudbury, and I got back into, there was a few years there where I sort of got away from flying. But before that, you'd mentioned float planes. Well, living here on the water on the Vineyard, I thought, boy, a float plane would really be a fun thing to learn to fly. So I had a roommate from college, and he was from Agawam Seaplane Base, which is on the Connecticut River. And I was out there one day, and I said, well, it would be fun to learn to fly a seaplane. So they had little Taylorcraft, 1946 BC-12D Taylorcraft, which is side-by-side seating. Here again, it's like the Cub and the Ronca Champ, 65 screaming horses, where you got out front, you stood on the float from behind, and you pulled the propeller to start the thing. Well, I went and took a lesson in that. I thought, this is really the coolest thing, to be going down the river, picking up speed, getting it on the step, lifting it off, flying. And I really, really loved it. So then I took some more lessons. He actually flew it down here and brought it into Lagoon Pond. And I finished taking the lessons down here. And I really, really enjoyed flying the float plane. And then I went and got my rating in float planes. Then, like I said, I got away from flying for a number of years, but when I was living in Sudbury, I went back to the old school that I'd graduated from in Boston, Wentworth Institute, one time, and got talking to some people there. And they also, one of the departments they had was learn to be aircraft maintenance. And they had just finished rebuilding a Taylorcraft BC-12D 1946. And it was gorgeous. It was really nice. And they were going to sell it. And I said, well, how do you go about selling it? Well, he said, we take offers. You know, put your offer in the envelope and go to a high bidder. Well, I put an offer in the envelope and got that airplane for $2,500. And it turned out Frank Fenner here on the Vineyard had actually worked on that plane because he'd been at school there while they were working on it. So I got it and flew over to Marlborough Airport. Now, Marlborough is right next to Sudbury, and it's a great little airport, but it's got about the shortest runway of any airport in Massachusetts. It's got only 1,600 feet, and there are trees at one end and a chain link fence at the other. And right in that chain link fence, it's got a big stop sign too, just in case anyone, just to remind you to stop before you hit the fence. Along the line, I thought after I had my, private and instrument and seaplane rating, I thought it'd be nice to get my commercial. It just makes you a little bit better. So I went and studied and took the written exam. And the written is good for 2 years from the time you take it. And I really didn't want to take it a second time. So I had, with I'd say about 6 weeks to go before that written exam expired, I said, if I'm going to get my commercial, I better do something about it now. So Ray Collins, who was the instructor at Marlborough Airport, he was also a designated examiner for the FAA. I said, Ray, I'd like to get, how long would it take to get my commercial? So he said, with all your experience, it shouldn't take long at all. But one thing I needed was 10 hours of what they call complex airplane time. And the definition of a complex airplane, it has to have at least 200 horsepower, it has to be retractable gear, and it has to have a constant speed propeller, which means you can change the pitch on the propeller. Well, I'd flown a Cessna 182 a lot, and that had a constant speed prop, and it had 235 horsepower, but it didn't have retractable gear, so that doesn't count. So anyway, I'd done all of the commercial maneuvers and everything, practiced all of those in a Cessna 172 and felt very comfortable. Well, at Marlborough Airport, they also sold airplanes. Well, here was this Piper Arrow. It looked pretty nice. I thought, that's pretty sweet. Had retractable gear, 200 horsepower, constant speed prop. Well, I got talking to a couple of friends, also there, and the three of us decided to go in on it together, and we bought it. I think, if I remember correctly, we paid about $25,000 for it. And I went, and I needed 10 hours, so I took the rest of my instruction to get the commercial in that airplane. And I felt very comfortable in it. And then went up with Ray, did my flight check, and he signed me off, and now I had my commercial rating. And I flew that airplane a lot. As it turns out, both partners over the next year, 2 years, both just dropped out. They weren't flying at all, and they said, Denny, we're just out, you can have the plane. And I had it, and had that plane for 14 years. And it was a lot of fun. I could put our three kids in the back seat, my wife in the seat next to me, and we would go off. We'd come down here to the Vineyard. Her brother lived in just outside Washington. We made a number of flights to Washington, made a couple of flights to Florida, and that was a very nice airplane. That moved along about 150 miles an hour. Good on instruments. Had a lot of fun with that. We'd go to Maine. We have a place in Maine. We'd fly up there and that. And I flew that a lot for many, many years.
What kind of weather experiences do you recall? Anything which catches your attention?
Oh, there's always a couple. Did a lot of instrument flying. I remember coming down here one time. It was a beautiful day leaving Marlborough. I kept that at Marlborough for a while, by the way. And then I ended up, after I got my, after the kids got bigger, Marlborough was so short that I was afraid to take off with all the kids and my wife and the dog in the plane, because the runway was so short. So I moved the plane over to Hanscom Field. So I flew out of Hanscom a lot. And one day I was coming down here to the Vineyard, and it was a beautiful day up there. And as I came down the Vineyard, it was beautiful over New Bedford, beautiful over Woods Hole, beautiful over West Tisbury, Chilmark, Gwinnett, and solid fog where all three airports were. So I called Otis Approach on the radio, filed for an instrument approach, shot it. But it was right down to minimums. It was actually a little below minimums, but it got in. That was all well. That was probably the lowest approach I ever had. Maybe the most memorable, I was by myself. And I was flying back from here to Hanscom Field. And my wife and kids had gone back in the car. And I was actually glad I did not have them in the car, in the plane with me on this flight. I knew there were thunderstorms over the Putnam area of Connecticut, just, west of Providence. And whenever you filed from here back then, they would give you the route, go over Providence, maybe to Putnam, then turn north, and then they would vector you into Hanscom. That's the route that they would give you, but as soon as you take off, they'd give you radar vectors, and it was usually straight up. So that was okay. I was going to stay way east of all the weather. Well, this time they wanted me to fly the route that they'd given me. And I could see just past Providence. I mean, it was ugly. And I told the controller I'd like to turn north. And he said, no, proceed. You want to keep me on course to Putnam. Well, I should have been a little stronger with him and told him what he could do. But I stuck my nose into this thing, and it was violent. I was going up 500 feet, down 500 feet. And I told him, I said, don't you know you've put me in this terrible weather? And he says, well, there's so much weather out there, we've turned that off on my radar, so I don't see it. I said, thanks a lot. I said, I can't hold my altitude plus or minus 500 feet. He said, gave me a wise answer. Would you like to declare an emergency? Well, I know emergencies mean filling out a lot of paper. And I said, no, but I'd like to get the hell out of here. He said, then he came back and says, well, do what you have to do. I said, fine, then I'm pulling a 180, which I took. And I remember a 180, turning back to the heading that I'd come from. Well, I made a procedure turn, and I'm just holding it, and I'm saying, baby, you can do this, you can do it. And I'd slowed the airplane down to maneuvering speed so I wasn't overstressing it. Well, just as I'm getting out of the weather, just getting into the rain, but it wasn't too bad, he turned me north, and he kept me right in the edge of that, all the way up until I turned east to make my final approach into Hanscom. Well, he turned me in, and I broke out into beautiful clear air, weather, landed at Hanscom, sunny, bright, tied the airplane down, got in my car, and I was headed back home to Sudbury, driving out Route 2A. But that was the direction the storm was coming. It was raining so hard that I pulled over the side of the road, and that was what I'd been flying in. This heavy rain that you basically couldn't drive in. It was the visibility was so low. And I remember when I was in it, looking out, it was hard to see even the wingtips. Thought I was flying a submarine. It was so wet. It was, and I wasn't pleased with the controller's behavior on that one. That was really improper. But it all worked out well. But I sort of let it go with that. Yeah, it was making that 180-degree turn to get out of there. And I usually fly with just one hand on the wheel. I had both. And I'm just making that turn, and I'm not even blinking. And I got my seat belt cinched right down because I didn't have a lot of clearance between the top of my head and the plane. And you don't want to bounce up, which had happened a couple of times in the past. But in going to our place in Maine, when the kids were little, I would rent a seaplane out of Moosehead Lake and then go up and land in lakes, different lakes, and that was great fun. Because back then, in Maine, it's still one of the places way up in the center in northern Maine where you still have some freedoms, where you can, you can sort of enjoy flying without having to feel that you're going to run into some airspace where you shouldn't be, or some controlled area where maybe you just shouldn't be. If you see a lake and you wanted to pop in, you just popped in. It's great. You've got to be careful in a float plane when you make the turn. It's planes, first of all, seaplanes are like weather vanes. They want to turn into the wind. That's just the way they're designed, with the tail and everything. If it will turn into the wind. So if you're taxiing downwind and you're turning into the wind to take off, you want to be going very slowly when you make that turn, because you've got centrifugal force wanting to take you this way. Then the wind can get under your wing. The plane's going a little sideways so that the float is digging in. You've got everything working to tip that plane over. Where when you're turning from upwind to downwind, it's not that way. You can add more power. You've sort of got to force it around. But turning downwind to upwind, you just sort of want to let the wind gently turn you. I never wanted to be the entertainment. Also in landing or whenever flying, and the same holds true in boating when you're docking, what's your escape route? In other words, if something isn't right, okay, how am I going to get out of here? Well, that's what a missed approach procedure is. If you come down to your minimum descent altitude and you don't see the ground or you don't see the strobes or some reference, what's my escape route? Well, on an instrument approach, they give you your escape route. It's your missed approach plate. But anytime, if you're landing in a stiff crosswind or whatever, what do you need to be prepared for so that you don't bend this thing? Or just provide entertainment for those watching, which I never wanted to be the entertainment. Hold that power. You don't have to make the commitment of coming totally off on your power until you really feel you've got it, so that you've got a little extra speed, you can play with this. And then we say, all right, now I got it. Now you gently pull back. Then, of course, with a tailwheel airplane, it's very different because there's two ways to land it. You do the three-point landing, which is a full stall. You bring it down and you just keep coming back on the wheel or the stick, whichever controls it. And basically, you're trying to keep the airplane flying as long as you can without adding any power until it finally just settles. Now, granted, you don't want to be too high off the runway at this. I mean, you want to level off within a foot of the runway, and you just keep coming back, very slowly, but it's all feel. In other words, you make those adjustments, and you become one with the airplane. It becomes so much feel. It's a, they talk about the old stick and rudder. It's a feel. And it's amazing how you just get in tune with this. Now, the other way, if it's real windy and gusty, you do a wheel landing where you're carrying more speed. You bring it down, you get the front two wheels on, and then you go forward on the stick. And that sort of pins it to the ground. Then, once you got it pinned, you come back on the power and you hold it until the tail wheel settles, and then you come back on the stick because you want to lock the tail wheel onto the ground. You don't want it bouncing and coming up again. So if you're doing a crosswind and a high wind, you may come down first and you're going to stick it on one wheel, and then you're going to let the other wheel touch, and then the tail wheel will settle. That takes a little more finesse. And all airplanes land a little bit differently. So you find what works best for your airplane, and the longer you fly it, you sort of experiment with it, and then it becomes, it just becomes so automatic. It was funny, I landed the Arrow once at the Vineyard here on 6. And when I looked down after I landed it, I had that wheel all the way over to hold myself. I had a crosswind coming in from the left. And you drop that wing to hold into the wing. And when I landed and touched down, my control wheel was locked all the way against the stops to hold that. As you're slowing down, you've got to add more and more. But it was all the way against the stops to keep that from drifting. Any more crosswind, and so I was probably right at the max that the plane could take. I can remember I've landed at Falmouth Airport. You mentioned that a number of times. I can remember one time too, my wife and I were down at having dinner with some friends in Falmouth, and we had flown down and we're flying back, and we took off. It was probably around midnight, and there were no lights, and it was going down this runway. It was like into a black cavern. I had my landing light on so I could see the runway, but it was just all black. And then soon as I lifted up and you popped up over the trees, of course, there all the lights just appeared. Another thing interesting on that line too, taking off, especially on Nantucket, taking off on 2-4, where you'd be taking out over the water at night. Here you've got the reference, you see lights, everything, and then all of a sudden there is none. And you want to know that so it doesn't surprise you. And then if you're comfortable on the gauges, you basically say, soon as I lift off, I'm just going to go on the gauges. I don't care what's going on outside, because you've lost all reference out there. And if you don't have a reference, it can turn into spatial disorientation very, very quickly. And then after that, it's disaster.
Well, that's a good place to end. I've only got a couple of minutes left on here.
We'll talk about the DC-3 the next time.
Oh. What on,
I've actually did a movie about that one.
you have that on tape?
Oh, yeah.
I want to see that.
Yep. As a matter of fact, you can go online at MVTV right now and see it.
Oh, it's on?
Yeah, they're still showing it, I think, some. But if you go on to Video on Demand,
Great.
I've got flying in the B-17, flying the DC-3, and flying, I went with Buddy Wyatt in the 172. He flew from the right seat. I held the camera out the window on the left seat. No gloves, couple of days before Christmas, several years ago. Cold, oh my God, my hands went numb in about 5 minutes, and they were out the window for an hour and 20 minutes. Holding a camera out the window as we flew around the island at 500 feet. And then Buddy flew in over Edgartown, Oak Bluffs, and Tisbury, all at about 500 feet. But it was neat. It's a whole perimeter thing of the Vineyard. It's got to be, I would say, 3 years now. I've flown right seat a number of times, where I flew the legs, flying with a friend of mine in his plane, and he would let me fly it. Beach Baron, I've done several flights in a TBM 700, which is a turboprop, which is, oh, that'll spoil you. That's pretty nice. But a little over a year ago, I had bypass surgery. So my physical is run out. I haven't gone to see if I can get it reinstated. I still get to fly with friends, so I can do a takeoff, landing. I've flown so long all my life, it's like, it's sort of second nature flying.